The first abyss gate in recorded history opened 300 years ago in the Valdren Plains, and the scholar who witnessed it wrote in his account that the air did not tear so much as forget itself, that the boundary between the world as it was and the world as it suddenly was not simply came undone at a point above the eastern field where the wheat had been growing that morning and where nothing grew again for 11 years after. The scholar's account was the first entry in what became the Adventure Guild's historical archive. His name was Aldren Voss. He had not been a hunter. He had been a grain merchant on his way to market when the gate opened. He had survived the gate's first beast by running and had documented what he survived with the specific precision of someone who understood that what they had seen was going to matter to people who had not seen it and would need the seeing described as accurately as possible. His account described the beast that came through as wrong in the way that things were wrong when they violated the expectations that the world had built through all the years of existing the way it had existed. Not wrong because it was dangerous, though it was dangerous. Wrong because it was from somewhere that operated on different principles than the principles the world had been built on, and the wrongness was visible in its form and its movement and the specific quality of the air around it, which had the same forgetting quality as the air around the gate itself. 300 years later the abyss gates were still opening. The frequency had increased. The size had increased. The beast classifications had expanded as the guild's hunters encountered more of them and developed the taxonomy that the rank system was built on. What had not changed was the essential nature of the event, the specific wrongness of something that came from a place operating on different principles entering a world that had been built on its own principles and expected to continue on them. The world of Ethon had built its response to this wrongness on two foundations. The first was the Spirit Council's contracting system. Spirits had always existed in Ethon. Long before the first abyss gate they had been present in the realm's spiritual substrate, expressions of the natural magical energies that flowed through the land and the sky and the water, entities of varying power and nature that the realm's population had coexisted with in varying degrees of relationship across recorded history. When the abyss gates opened, the founders of what became the Spirit Council understood quickly that uncontracted humans were inadequate to the task of fighting what came through the gates and that contracted humans, humans who had formed bonds with spirits and could draw on the spirits' power in combat, were not. The contracting ceremony was developed, the registry was established, the sanctums were built, and the framework that made every person in Ethon a potential defender of the realm through the spirit bond was operational within 2 generations of the first gate. The second foundation was the Adventure Guild's ranking system. A hunter with a freshly contracted low-tier spirit and no combat experience was not equivalent to a hunter with a mature high-tier contract and years of gate responses behind them, and matching hunters to gate assignments without accounting for this difference produced outcomes that the Guild's early records documented in detail that was difficult to read and that had motivated the rank system's development. The Guild established the kill certification process, the progression table that mapped certified kills against rank thresholds, and the branch office network that maintained the records and processed the applications. Rank F was the entry designation, given to any registered contractor who had completed the basic Guild orientation and held a valid Spirit Council certification. It was not a combat rank. It was an administrative acknowledgement of existence in the system. Rank E was the first combat certification, earned by documented kills of F-rank beasts in a volume the Guild's progression table specified. The hunters who held E rank were capable fighters with developing contracts and were assigned to the small residential gates that opened in settled areas and whose beast populations were manageable for a pair of E rank hunters working together. Rank D was earned through documented E rank beast kills in greater volume or through demonstrated performance against D rank beasts. D-rank hunters were the backbone of the Guild's standard response network, competent and experienced enough to handle the majority of the gate types that opened with regular frequency across the realm. Rank C was where the Guild's internal culture acknowledged that the hunter in question had genuinely committed to the profession and developed the contract's potential to a level that made them a reliable resource for the more serious gate classifications. The progression from D to C required volume of certified kills that produced a specific kind of hunter, one who had been in enough gate responses that their decision-making in combat was no longer theoretical. Rank B was where the public started to know names. B-rank hunters held contracts developed to a level that could challenge the beasts that came through the larger and more dangerous gate types, and their gate assignments were the assignments that the settled population paid attention to because the settled population could see the difference between a gate that was handled without incident and a gate that wasn't. Rank A was where the guild's senior operational leadership drew from when something required the best available response. A-rank hunters were rare in any given region, and their presence at a gate response changed the response's character the way the presence of any genuinely skilled specialist changed the character of any complex operation. Rank S was where the documentation in the guild's historical archive became the kind of documentation that scholars studied rather than just administrators referenced. S-rank hunters were figures of public significance whose contracts had developed over years of the most demanding gate responses the realm produced into something that the guild's standard assessment framework measured in ranges rather than precise values because the precise values exceeded the framework's upper measurement boundaries. Rank SS was held by fewer than 40 people in Ethon's 300 years of recorded hunter history. Rank SSS had been achieved by 9. Cale knew all of this. He had grown up in the frontier settlement of Aldren, a community of approximately 400 people situated in the northeastern reaches of the realm where the terrain was difficult and the infrastructure was limited and the abyss gates opened with the frequency that frontier regions produced, which was higher than the settled interior's frequency and lower than the deep frontier's frequency and exactly high enough that Cale had been watching contracted hunters respond to gates for as long as he could remember watching anything. His mother was Aldren's herbalist. Her contracted spirit was a gentle earth affinity entity she had registered with the Spirit Council at 18 and that manifested in her work as an enhanced sensitivity to plant properties and a mild healing acceleration that made her considerably more effective at her profession than she would have been without the contract. She was not a hunter. She had never fought a beast. Her contract had been chosen specifically for its utility to the work she intended to do, which was the legitimate and honored use of the contracting system that the majority of Ethon's contracted population represented. Hunters were the minority of contractors. Everyone contracted a spirit for the same fundamental reason, which was that a contracted spirit enhanced the quality of everything the contractor did in the spirit's domain of affinity. A fire affinity spirit contracted by a smithy produced better metalwork. A water affinity spirit contracted by a fisher produced better catches. The combat applications that the Adventure Guild's ranking system was built around were one application of the system among many. They were the most publicly significant application because the Abyss Gates made them existentially important to the realm. But the contracting system was not a hunter system. It was a human potential enhancement system that the hunter profession depended on more visibly than other professions because the enhancement was the difference between surviving a beast encounter and not. Cale had watched hunters respond to gates from the time he was old enough to watch. Not because hunting was the only thing to watch in Aldren. Because the gate responses were the most concentrated demonstration available of what a contracted spirit made possible, and Cale was the kind of person who watched demonstrations of what things made possible with sustained and specific attention. He had been preparing for his contracting ceremony for 3 years before it arrived. Not preparing in the way of acquiring resources or connections or the kind of backing that wealthy families provided their children before their ceremonies, because he had none of those things and had not expected to have them. Preparing in the way of understanding. He had read every document about the contracting process that the Spirit Council's Public Information Office distributed to settlement communities. He had asked the guild hunters who came through Aldren questions about their contracts during the periods between gate responses when they were willing to talk. He had listened to his mother describe the experience of her own ceremony and her own contracting with the specific attention he gave to everything he was trying to understand. He understood that the ceremony was the beginning and that what happened at the beginning shaped everything that followed. He understood that his resonance, the quality of his soul's spiritual frequency that the resonance crystal would read, was something he had not been able to measure or evaluate before the ceremony because the measuring equipment was in the sanctums and the sanctums were not in Aldren. He understood that resonance quality correlated loosely with the tier of spirit that would be compatible with it, but that the correlation was loose enough that the specific outcome was not predictable from any prior assessment. He had been as prepared as preparation without information allowed him to be. On the morning of his 18th birthday he made the journey from Aldren to the nearest sanctum, a 3-hour walk to the town of Vethra where the Spirit Council maintained a branch sanctum and where the ceremony would be conducted. The sanctum in Vethra was not a large facility. Branch sanctums in frontier regions were functional rather than impressive, built to serve the contracting needs of the regional population without the architectural investment that the capital and major city sanctums represented. The building was stone and well-maintained and had the specific quality of a place that took its function seriously without taking its appearance particularly seriously, which Cale found appropriate. He registered at the ceremony desk, signed the documentation the officiants required, and joined the 3 other people who were scheduled for that morning's ceremony session in the waiting area. The other 3 were from Vethra itself. He could tell from the way they were dressed and the way they occupied the space, the specific ease of people in a familiar environment performing a significant personal ritual. 2 of them knew each other and were talking in the low voices of people who had been talking about this day for a long time and were now in the day and were managing the transition from anticipation to event. The third was alone and quiet in a way that was not unfriendly but was private, processing something inwardly that the waiting area was not the place to process outwardly. Cale sat and was still. The ceremony began with the first of the 3 Vethra residents. He watched from the waiting area through the open arch that connected it to the ceremony hall. The ceremony hall's resonance crystal was a large clear formation mounted at the center of a raised dais, approximately the height of a person and the width of a person's outstretched arms, with a quality to its surface that was not quite transparency and not quite opacity but something between the two that made the crystal appear to contain depth rather than just volume. The first veteran placed her hand on the crystal. The crystal's internal light shifted immediately, a warm amber glow building from the point of contact and spreading through the crystal's volume, and the officiants watched the display with the professional attention of people reading information from a familiar medium. They conferred briefly, the ceremony's senior officiant spoke a designation notation into the official record, and a spirit was summoned from the registry in its transparent form for the veteran to see and choose. The spirit was a mid-tier water affinity entity whose transparent form showed a flowing quality that made its nature apparent. The veteran chose it without hesitation, the blood oath was completed, and she stepped back from the crystal with the specific quality of someone who had just had a door open that had been closed their entire life up to that moment. The second ceremony took slightly longer. The crystal's resonance search produced 2 compatible spirits rather than one, and the veteran had to choose between them, which the officiants facilitated with the practiced guidance of people who had helped people make this choice many times. He chose a fire affinity entity and completed the oath with the expression of someone who had been hoping for fire and had received fire and was only now allowing themselves to feel the relief of that. The third was quick and simple, a single compatible spirit that suited the veteran's resonance so directly that the crystal's display barely needed to search before producing the match. Cale's name was called. He stood and walked to the ceremony hall and placed his hand on the resonance crystal. The crystal's internal light shifted at the point of contact the way it had shifted for every person before him. He watched the light move through the crystal's volume and felt the specific quality of the crystal's surface under his palm, which had a warmth to it that was not temperature but something else, the specific warmth of something alive in a way that stone was not usually alive, and he held still and waited for the amber glow of a resonance match to begin building. The amber glow did not build. The light in the crystal moved. It was not still. It searched in the way that the officiant's expressions told him it was searching, the crystal's processing of his resonance running through the registry's entries looking for the frequency correspondence that produced a match. He watched the officiant's faces, and the officiant's faces were doing something that the previous 3 ceremonies had not made them do, which was producing the specific controlled quality of professionals who have encountered something unusual and are managing their response to it in the way that professionalism required. The search continued. He kept his hand on the crystal and kept still because removing his hand before the search concluded was not something he had seen anyone do and was not something he was going to do. He looked at the crystal's light moving through its volume and thought about what the light was doing, which was reading his resonance against 400 years of accumulated registry entries looking for a corresponding frequency, and he thought about what the absence of the amber glow of correspondence meant in the context of what he understood about how the process worked. The search concluded. No amber glow. No spirit summoned. No match. The senior officiant's expression completed its transition from controlled professional management of an unusual result to the specific gentle composure of someone who was about to deliver information they had delivered before in different contexts and that was never easy to deliver regardless of the practice. She said his resonance had been fully processed by the crystal and the registry search had completed without producing a compatible match. He said he understood and asked if there was a possibility of error in the search. She said the crystal was functioning correctly and the search had been complete. She said that unmatched resonances were not common but were not unknown in the registry's 400-year history. She said she was sorry. He said he would like to understand the process fully if she was willing to explain it, because understanding what had happened was more useful to him than not understanding it. She looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone who had expected a different response to the information and was recalibrating to the response they had received. She explained. The Spirit Council's registry contained every contractable spirit that had been identified, assessed, and entered into the registration system since the Council's founding. The registry search identified compatible spirits by matching the contractor's soul resonance frequency against the documented frequencies of registered spirits. A match produced a compatibility confirmation and the spirit was summoned in transparent form. An absence of a match meant that no registered spirit's frequency corresponded to the contractor's soul resonance within the compatibility threshold the contracting mechanism required. She said this was not a reflection of the quality of his resonance. She said resonance quality and resonance compatibility were different properties and the absence of a registry match said nothing about the former. He said he understood the distinction. He said he had one more question. She said go ahead. He said was there any process by which the registry's coverage of the contractable spirit population could be assessed for completeness, meaning was there a mechanism by which an unregistered spirit whose frequency corresponded to an unmatched contractor's resonance could be identified? She was quiet for a moment. She said the registry was the comprehensive record of the contractable spirit population as it had been documented across 400 years of Spirit Council operation and that the Council's position was that the registry represented the complete population of contractable spirits in the realm. He said he understood. He thanked her and the other officiants and walked out of the sanctum into the afternoon light of Vethra's main street. He stood on the sanctum steps for a moment. The street was ordinary in the way that Vethra's streets were ordinary, the activity of a provincial town proceeding with the specific mundane energy of a place where people were living their lives in the way that people lived their lives when the day was not a significant one. For him the day was significant. The significance was not visible in the street. He thought about what the senior officiant had said. The registry was the comprehensive record of the contractable spirit population as it had been documented across 400 years of Spirit Council operation. Not as it existed. As it had been documented. Documentation was not the same as existence and the senior officiant had not said the same thing twice though the two sentences had been constructed to sound like she had that he began walking back toward Aldemir. He thought about 400 years. He thought about what had existed in the realm before the Spirit Council had been founded and before the registry had been established and before the documentation process had begun. He thought about the founding of the registry and what the founding required, which was a survey of the realm's spirit population by the founding generation's spiritual scholars, and what the founding survey's completeness depended on, which was the survey tools and methods available to the founding generation. He thought about what the founding generation's survey tools and methods had been built to look for and what they might not have been built to look for. He thought about this for the 3 hours of the walk back to Aldemir. He did not reach a conclusion on the walk. He reached the beginning of a direction. The direction required more information than the walk provided. He arrived in Aldemir at the dinner hour and his mother was in the kitchen of their home and he sat at the table and told her what had happened with the specific directness of someone who valued accurate information over comfortable information and who knew that the person he was telling valued the same thing. She listened without interrupting. When he finished she was quiet for a moment. Then she said she was sorry. He said he knew. He said he was not yet finished thinking about what it meant and he was not going to act on whatever the thinking produced until the thinking was done, and the thinking was not done tonight. She said that was sensible. He said he was going to stay in Vethra for a few days while he thought. He said the inn near the sanctum was reasonable and the sanctum's public reading room had Spirit Council documentation that he wanted to access. She said she understood. He went to bed. In the morning he walked back to Vethra and checked into the inn and spent the first day in the sanctum's public reading room going through the Spirit Council's publicly accessible historical documentation with the focused attention he gave to things he needed to understand thoroughly. The Spirit Council's public documentation was extensive and covered the contracting system's operational framework, the registry's maintenance procedures, the sanctum's function and distribution, the history of the system's development, and the theoretical basis for the contracting mechanism. He read all of it that was accessible and built a comprehensive picture of what the public documentation said and what it did not say and where the gaps between the two were. The gaps were not dramatic. They were the ordinary gaps of any institution's public documentation, places where the operational detail was summarized rather than specified, places where the historical record was thin because the records from those periods were thin, places where the theoretical framework was described at the level of practical function rather than fundamental mechanism. One of the gaps was in the founding period's documentation. The Spirit Council's public account of its founding described the founding generation's work in terms that were functional and institutional, the establishing of the contracting ceremony, the development of the registry, the construction of the first sanctums, the framework agreements with what would become the Adventure Guild. It did not describe in detail the survey process by which the registry's initial population had been identified and documented. It referenced the survey as a comprehensive assessment of the realm's spirit population without specifying what comprehensive meant in the context of the tools and methods available to the founding generation 400 years ago. He noted this gap. He spent the second day in the inn's common room thinking rather than reading, because he had acquired the information available from the reading and the thinking required space that the reading room's specific quality did not provide. On the morning of the third day he woke before dawn and lay in the small inn room looking at the ceiling in the dark and thinking about resonance frequencies and registry completeness and the founding generation's survey methodology and the specific sentence the senior officiant had used that was not the same sentence she had meant it to sound like. He was thinking about this when he became aware that something was in the room with him. Not in the way of hearing a sound or seeing a shape. In the way of a quality of the air changing. Not temperature. Not pressure. Something more fundamental than either, a shift in the ambient character of the space that the room occupied, as if the room's relationship to the world it was part of had briefly become more complex than a small inn room's relationship to the world was ordinarily complex. He sat up slowly. In the corner of the room opposite the door, in the space between the wardrobe and the window where the pre-dawn dark was thickest, something was present. He could not describe it as a shape because shape implied a bounded form and what was in the corner was not bounded in the way that forms were bounded. He could not describe it as a light because it was not producing illumination in the way that light produced illumination. He could describe it as a presence because presence was what it was, a concentration of something that the room had not contained before this moment and that the room was now organized around in the way that rooms organize themselves around things that mattered. He did not move. It did not move. They remained in this configuration while the pre-dawn dark in the window began its slow transition toward the first gray of morning and the inn's ambient sounds continued exactly as they had been continuing because whatever was in the corner of the room was not producing any effect on the physical environment beyond the effect on the air that he had already registered. He looked at the presence in the corner and thought about what he was looking at with the same quality of attention he had given to everything else he had tried to understand, which was full and focused and without the distortion that fear or urgency would have produced. He was not afraid that he was not unafraid in the way of someone who had assessed the situation and determined there was nothing to fear. He was unafraid in the way of someone who had recognized that fear was not the appropriate tool for understanding what he was looking at and had set it aside in favor of the tool that was. He looked at the presence and thought that it was old. Not old in the way of people or buildings or even of the sanctum's resonance crystal which was centuries old and showed it. Old in the way that the Vethra hills were old, in the way that the bedrock under Aldren was old, in the way that things were old when the scale of their age exceeded the scale at which age was usually measured. The oldness was not a visual property. It was something the presence communicated without communicating it, the way that certain experiences communicated their nature before any of their specific content arrived. The presence communicated. Not in words. Not in images. In understanding that arrived without the intermediate mechanism of language, the meaning present in his mind in the specific way that comprehension arrived when it came from somewhere that was not processing information through the steps that information normally processed through on its way to comprehension. It told him what it was. The understanding that arrived was, I am not in the registry because I was not surveyed. I was not surveyed because the survey did not reach the layer of the substrate where I exist. I am not separate from the realm's spirits. I am what the realm's spirits are expressions of. I have been present in Ethon since before the Spirit Council existed and before the registry was established and before the founding generation conducted the survey that produced the registry's initial population, that I was present when the first abyss gate opened. I have been present through every gate that has opened since. I am the layer beneath the layer that the contracting system was built on. He received this understanding and held it and thought about it in the way he thought about everything, which was carefully and without rushing toward a conclusion before the thinking had produced one. He understood that the resonance crystal's search through the registry had produced no match, not because his resonance was deficient or anomalous. Because his resonance corresponded to this presence's frequency, and this presence's frequency was not in the registry because this presence had never been surveyed and therefore had never been registered. The registry was not the comprehensive record of the contractable spirit population as it existed. It was the comprehensive record of the contractable spirit population as it had been documented. The documentation had missed this. The understanding arrived again. Your resonance is the first resonance in 400 years that corresponds to my frequency. I have been waiting for a resonance that corresponded. I am offering you the contract. He looked at the presence in the corner of the room while the window continued its transition from pre-dawn dark to the first gray of morning, and the inn continued its ambient sounds and the world outside continued its ordinary progression through an ordinary morning. He thought about what the contract meant. He thought about it not in terms of what it offered him specifically, though he thought about that too. He thought about it in terms of what it was. A contract with the layer beneath the layer the contracting system was built on. A contract with the source of what the registered spirits were expressions of. A contract with something that had been present in the realm since before the records existed and that the records had missed. He thought about the abyss gates and the beasts and the rank system and the adventure guild and the settlement records he had spent his life watching hunters build, and the door that the contracting ceremony had closed, and the specific direction the thinking of the past 3 days had been building toward. He said, out loud, because saying things out loud was how he confirmed that the internal understanding had achieved the clarity that external expression required. I understand what you are, and I understand what the contract means, and I accept. The understanding arrived, then we begin. The contract sealed. It did not seal through the blood oath mechanism of the Spirit Council's standard contracting process. It sealed through the resonance alignment that the understanding had described, his soul's resonance and the presence's resonance meeting at the frequency they shared, and the meeting producing the bond that was not administered by the Spirit Council's framework because the Spirit Council's framework had not been designed to administer something that predated the framework. What he felt when the contract sealed was different from what his mother had described about her own contracting, and different from what the hunters he had questioned had described about theirs. They had described something like a door opening, a new resource becoming available, an additional capacity alongside the existing self. What he felt was something more like a depth becoming visible. Not an addition alongside what he already was. A layer beneath what he already was becoming accessible, the way that a body of water that had appeared to have a surface became visible as having depth when you understood that the surface was the surface of something rather than the surface of nothing. He sat in the small inn room with the morning light coming through the window and felt the depth that the contract had made accessible, and thought about what it was and what it made possible. The presence that had been in the corner of the room was no longer in the corner of the room in the way it had been. It was present in the way that a contracted spirit was present to its contractor, available rather than localized, the bond making the spirit's presence a quality of the contractor's immediate experience rather than a thing occupying a position in the physical space. He dressed and went downstairs to the common room. He ate breakfast with the specific appetite of someone who had spent 3 days thinking intensely and whose body had opinions about this and was expressing them through hunger. He ate and thought about the sequence of practical questions that the contract's existence produced. The Spirit Council's registry did not contain this contract. The Adventure Guild's registration system required Spirit Council certification of a contracted spirit as the prerequisite for hunter registration. Hunter registration was the prerequisite for kill certification. Kill certification was the prerequisite for rank progression. He had a contract. The contract was not in the registry. The standard pathway was closed. He had known the standard pathway was closed before the contract existed. The contract had not opened the standard pathway. What the contract had done was give him something to work with that the standard pathway's closure had not given him, which was a contracted spirit whose nature he was going to need to understand much more thoroughly before he could determine what paths were available. He finished breakfast and paid the innkeeper and collected his bag from the room. He walked through Vethra's morning streets toward the road back to Aldren. He passed the sanctum. He looked at the sanctum as he passed it. The resonance crystal inside had searched the registry and found nothing. The registry had found nothing because the registry did not contain what corresponded to his resonance. The registry did not contain what corresponded to his resonance because the registry was a 400-year-old document that had missed something. He kept walking. 3 hours later he was home. His mother looked at him when he came through the door with the specific attention of a person who had been waiting to see what 3 days of thinking produced in someone they knew well enough to read the result on their face before the person had said a word. She said something changed. He said yes. She said tell me. He sat at the table and told her, not everything immediately and the sequence in which it had happened, because the sequence was part of the telling and rushing past the sequence to the conclusion would have produced a less accurate account than the sequence deserved. She listened without interrupting, which was her way with things she needed to understand before she had anything useful to contribute. When he finished she was quiet for a long time. He let the quiet be what it needed to be, then she said, the crystal found nothing because the registry found nothing and the registry found nothing because what you correspond to was never in the registry. He said yes. She said and the thing that was never in the registry is the thing that the registry's contents draw their power from. He said yes. She looked at her hands for a moment and then looked at him. She said she did not fully understand what that meant in terms of what the contract would produce in practice. He said he did not yet fully understand it either. He said fully understanding it was the work. He said he had a beginning and the beginning was more than he had had 3 days ago. She said what was the beginning? He said the beginning was that an abyss gate was going to open eventually and he was going to find out what the contract produced when something came through it. She looked at him. She said she was his mother and she needed him to know that what he had just said was not the reassuring statement he appeared to believe it was. He said he understood that. He said it was still the beginning. She said she knew. She got up and went back to the kitchen and he sat at the table and felt the depth the contract had made accessible and thought about the abyss gates and the beasts and the rank system and what a contract with the source of what all contracted spirits drew their power from would produce when something came through a gate and tried to kill him. He did not have to wait long to find out. 12 days after the contract sealed, an abyss gate opened in the eastern fields outside Aldren, in the same general location where Aldren Voss's grain had been growing when the first gate in the realm's history had opened 300 years ago in a different field in a different part of the realm, and the coincidence of location was something Kale noticed and filed and did not have time to think about further because the gate was open and the beasts were coming through and the guild team from Vethra was 3 hours away. He picked up the equipment he had been preparing for 12 days and went to the eastern fields. The gate was the size of a residential gate, which the guild's classification system described as a gate whose aperture was smaller than 4 meters in any dimension and whose beast output was consistent with F and E rank classifications. It was producing E rank beasts. He could read them through the contract in a way that he had not been able to read anything before the contract existed, the beast's spiritual composition visible to him the way a building structure was visible to an architect, the specific organization of the beast's essence clear and specific and readable. He understood from the reading that E-rank beasts were not weak. They were the second rank above the baseline for a reason. What they were was manageable, which was a different thing, manageable meaning that their spiritual composition had specific structural characteristics that specific applied force at specific points would compromise. He applied the force. Not in the way of a trained combatant with years of gate response experience. The substrate spirit did not manifest the way a registered spirit manifested. It did not produce a visible combat form that he fought alongside. It was present the way the contract was present, as a depth beneath his immediate experience that was accessible, and what he accessed from it in the eastern field outside Aldren was the specific capacity to direct the substrate's force through the resonance connection at the precise points the reading had identified. The first beast went down. Not cleanly. He had understood the theory of it, and the practice of it was not the theory, and the gap between theory and practice in a combat context was a gap that produced specific physical consequences that he experienced directly and that he filed for future calibration. He survived the first beast's response before the response could compromise the outcome, and the outcome was that the first beast was down and he was standing and the gate was producing more. The second beast he fought better than the first because the first beast had closed part of the gap between the theory and the practice, and the third better than the second for the same reason, and by the time the guild team arrived from Vethra 3 hours later the gate was closed and the field was quiet, and he was sitting at the field's edge covered in beast ichor with the specific quality of someone who had just learned a significant number of things in a short period and was organizing them in the order they would need to be applied to the next instance of the same situation. The guild team's B-rank hunter was a man named Corvin Ashfeld, whose contracted spirit was a high-tier wind affinity entity that produced, among its other combat functions, the capacity to read residual spiritual signatures in the aftermath of a combat. This was a standard field assessment tool that B-rank hunters with wind affinity contracts often developed because the residual signature reading was useful for determining what had come through a gate and what had been used against it and whether anything remained in the area. Corvin Ashfeld read the field. He read for longer than standard field assessments took. Then he came to where Kale was sitting and looked at him with the specific expression of someone whose professional instrument had produced a result the professional had never seen before and who was determining what to do with the result. He said, "What is your contracted spirit?" Kale said, "I am contracted." Corvin Ashfeld said, "That is not what I asked." Kale said, "I know. I said what I said accurately." Corvin Ashfeld looked at him for another moment. Then he looked back at the field where the residual signature was still present in the way that residual signatures persisted for several hours after a combat's conclusion. He said, "Whatever cleared this field was not a registered spirit." Kale said, "The field is cleared and the gate is closed." Corvin Ashfeld said, "Yes." He said it slowly in the way of someone acknowledging a fact that was true and insufficient simultaneously. He went back to his team and they conducted the standard post-gate assessment and produced the standard report, and when the standard report was complete he wrote the field note that the assessment's anomalous residual signature required, and the field note said that an unregistered contractor had cleared the gate before the guild team's arrival and that the contractor had declined to identify their spirit and that the residual signature produced by the combat was unlike any registered spirits. Documented combat output pattern in the guild's field reference database. He submitted the report and the field note to the Vethra branch and went back to doing his job. Kale walked home through the eastern field at the end of the afternoon and his mother was waiting at the door and she looked at the condition he was in and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "How did it go?" He said, "I understand the beginning now." He said the beginning was harder than the theory suggested and more instructive than the theory could have been. She said, "Are you hurt?" He said, "Not significantly." She said, "Come inside." He came inside. He sat at the table while she assessed the not significant injuries with the professional attention of someone who had been practicing herbalism for 20 years and whose contracted earth spirit sensitivity enhancement made not significant a precise categorization rather than a hopeful one. He thought about Corvin Ashfeld's field note and what it would produce and how much time he had before whatever it produced required him to be further along in his understanding of the contract than he currently was. He thought about 12 days of preparation and 3 hours of gate response and the gap between theory and practice and how many gate responses it would take before the gap was small enough that the outcomes were consistently clean rather than consistently survivable. He thought about what the contract's reading function had shown him about the E-rank beasts and what a D-rank beast's reading would show and what applying the substrate force at the identified structural points of a D-rank beast would require relative to what the E-rank beasts had required. He thought about the rank system and the kill certification process and the Adventure Guild's registration requirement and the Spirit Council's registry and the Founding Generations survey methodology and the 400-year-old document that had missed something. He thought about all of this while his mother worked and the evening came through the window and the field outside was quiet and the gate was closed and Aldemir continued its ordinary life in the way that frontier settlements continued their ordinary lives between gate responses, which was with the specific quality of communities that had learned to live in the presence of intermittent extraordinary events without being defined by them. He was going to be defined by his. The morning after the first gate response, Kale went back to the eastern fields. Not because there was another gate. Because the eastern fields were where the first response had happened and standing in the space where something had happened while it was still fresh was the most efficient method he had found for extracting the precise understanding of what the happening had produced and what it had not produced and what the difference between those two things required. He stood in a field where the ichor was still present in the grass and the gate's closure had left the specific quality of post-gate air that hunters described as the settling, the moment when the ambient spiritual pressure of an active gate dissipated back into the substrate and the ordinary qualities of the environment reasserted themselves. And he thought about what he had done and how he had done it and where the gap between what he had understood about the process and what the process had actually been was the largest. The gap was large in specific places. He knew the theory of the substrate spirit's force application with precision. He had spent 12 days developing his understanding of the reading function and extrapolating from the reading function's output what the force application to identified structural weak points would produce. The theory was correct. He had confirmed this by surviving the gate response and by the fact that the beasts had gone down rather than him. What the theory had not prepared him for was the speed at which the reading function needed to produce its output and the precision at which the force application needed to be directed when the beast whose structural weak points he was identifying was also moving and also applying force toward him simultaneously. The reading function was fast. It was not yet fast enough for the combat context it was operating in, or rather it was fast enough but he was not yet fast enough in processing what the reading function produced and translating that processing into directed force application, and the delay between the reading and the application was where the E-rank beasts had found the opportunities that had produced the not significant injuries his mother had assessed the previous evening. This was the gap. The gap was a processing speed problem rather than a capability problem, and processing speed problems were problems that repetition closed rather than problems that additional understanding closed. He could not think his way to faster processing. He had to do his way to faster processing, and doing required more gate responses. He walked back to Aldemir. He told his mother he was going to be responding to gates in the region for the foreseeable future and that he would need her to alert him immediately when the settlement's monitoring post received a gate signal from any of the monitoring nodes in the surrounding area. Aldemir's monitoring post was a standard frontier installation, a Spirit Council sensing array that detected active gates within a 20-kilometer radius and displayed the gate's location and preliminary rank classification on a board in the settlement's administrative building. Every frontier settlement in the realm had one. The monitoring infrastructure was one of the two things the Spirit Council's operational mandate required them to maintain in every inhabited area, the other being a sanctum or sanctum outpost for contracting ceremonies. His mother looked at him when he said foreseeable future with the expression of someone who was updating their understanding of what the previous evening's conversation about this being the beginning actually meant in practical terms. She said she would alert him. He said thank you. He spent the days between gate signals in the fields outside Aldemir doing what repetition required, which was practicing the specific translation sequence between reading function output and force application in the absence of an actual beast target by creating substrate resonance against the field's natural ground composition and directing force application through the generated resonance until the translation sequence became faster through the specific mechanism by which physical sequences became faster, which was the gradual reduction of the conscious processing step between intention and execution. He was not the first person to develop a combat skill through repetitive practice. He was the first person whose combat skill was built on the substrate connection rather than on a registered spirit's elemental affinity, which meant the specific qualities of his practice were different from what any training manual described and the specific qualities of his development were different from what any guild assessment framework was built to measure. He noted this and continued practicing. The second gate signal came on the 5th day. E rank. Northern approach, approximately 8 kilometers from Aldren, near the settlement of Thornfield, whose proximity to Aldren put them within the same guild response zone. The guild response team from Vethra would need approximately 2.5 hours to reach Thornfield from the branch office. The gate was producing beasts into a cultivated area where the damage to crops and the risk to livestock would begin accumulating immediately. He reached Thornfield in 45 minutes. The second response was better than the first in the ways he had been practicing for. The translation sequence was faster. The force application was more precisely directed. He took less damage and closed more of the gap between reading and application in 4 engagements than the first response's 12 engagements had closed. The guild team arrived to find the gate closed and Thornfield Settlement Council in the process of documenting the response in their official records at Kale's request. The Thornfield Settlement Council was cooperative about the documentation because the crops had been at risk and the crops were not at risk anymore, and the person who had made that happen had been direct and specific about what documentation he needed from them and had not asked for anything else. The documentation read, Gate response conducted by resident contractor of Aldren prior to guild team arrival. Gate classification E rank confirmed by guild team assessment. Gate closed. Beast clearance complete. Contractor's contracted spirit not identified by name. Combat output assessed as above E rank standard by Settlement Council witness observers. He thanked the council and walked home. The third gate response was 3 days after the second. The fourth was 2 days after the third. By the fourth response the E rank beasts were no longer producing the processing delay that had characterized the first response. The translation sequence had achieved a speed that the reading function's output was feeding into cleanly, and the force application was arriving at the identified structural points with a precision that the first response had only approximated. He noted this and updated the calibration to the next problem, which was the D rank beasts that were present at the fifth response alongside the E rank beasts, a mixed classification gate whose output suggested the gate itself was at the upper end of the E rank classification or possibly at the lower end of the D rank classification. D rank beasts were different from E rank beasts in the specific way that things were different when they had been subjected to the substrate's shifted conditions for longer and had developed in response to that subjection. Their structural composition was more complex than E rank beasts' composition, and the reading function's output for a D rank beast structural weak points was correspondingly more complex, the weak points more numerous and more specifically distributed, and the force application required to exploit them needing to be more precisely directed. That he survived the fifth response with more difficulty than the fourth. He calibrated from the fifth response, and the sixth was better and the seventh was better than the sixth, and by the eighth response the D rank beasts were manageable in the same way the E rank beasts had become manageable, not easily but reliably. He was building the settlement records throughout. Every gate response produced a new entry in the official records of whichever settlement was nearest to the gate. The entries were consistent in their format because consistency in format was what made a record rather than a collection of accounts, and he had developed the format on the first response and applied it to every subsequent one. Gate classification. Beast classifications encountered. Combat engagement outcome. Gate closure confirmation. Witness attestations from Settlement Council members present. His own name and residential location. The fact of the contracted spirit without the spirit's identity. He did not identify the spirit in the records because the spirit's identity was not a fact the records could accurately represent, since the Spirit Council's registry had no entry for the spirit, and recording a fact inaccurately was worse than not recording it. What the records could accurately represent was what he had done and what the outcome had been and who had witnessed it, and those three things, accumulated across the gate responses, were the ground he was building. On the morning of the 4th week he was responding to a C-rank gate at the edge of the frontier region's eastern boundary when a hunter he had not encountered before arrived at the gate site during the engagement. The hunter was not the guild team. The guild team would not arrive for another hour. This hunter had been in the area independently, a circumstance that was not uncommon for hunters working the frontier region between contract assignments, using the frontier's higher gate frequency to accumulate additional certified kills for their progression records. The hunter took one look at what Kale was doing with the C-rank gate's outer beasts and stopped moving. He watched for approximately 30 seconds. Then he activated his contracted spirit, a wind affinity entity whose manifestation produced a visible translucent form alongside the hunter, and helped clear the gate's remaining beasts from the left flank while Kale continued the right and center. When the gate was closed, the hunter looked at Kale across the cleared field with the specific expression of someone whose professional experience had just been given information that the professional experience had not prepared them to categorize. He said his name was Corvin Ashfeld. He said he was a B-rank hunter contracted with a wind spirit that had, among its other functions, the capacity to read residual spiritual signatures in the aftermath of a combat. He said he would like to read the field, which was standard procedure after a gate response and which Kale had no reason to decline. Kale said go ahead. Corvin Ashfeld read the field. The wind spirit's residual reading function extended from the hunter in a visible shimmer that moved across the cleared field, touching the areas where the beasts had been engaged and reading the spiritual impressions that combat output left in the substrate for several hours after its application. The reading was a standard field assessment tool. Hunters with wind affinity contracts often developed it because the residual signature told you what you needed to know about what had come through a gate and what had been used against it. Corvin Ashfeld read for longer than standard field assessments took. Then he came back to where Kale was standing and looked at him directly. He said, "The residual signature in this field does not match any registered spirit's combat output pattern in my reference database," Kale said. "The gate is closed." Corvin Ashfeld said, "That is not what I said." Kale said, "I know. I said what was accurate." Corvin Ashfeld looked at him for a moment. He said, "What is your contracted spirit?" Kale said, "I am contracted." Corvin Ashfeld said, "That is not what I asked." Kale said, "It is the most accurate answer I can give you." Corvin Ashfeld looked at him for another moment with the expression of a professional whose instrument had produced an anomaly and who was determining whether the anomaly required immediate action or careful documentation. He determined that it required careful documentation. He said he was going to submit a field note with the standard gate response report. He said the field note would describe the residual signature and its failure to match any registered pattern. He said he was noting this not as an accusation of anything but as an accurate record of what his assessment had found. Kale said he understood and that accurate records were the appropriate response. Corvin Ashfeld looked at him once more and then organized the gate site documentation with the efficiency of someone who did this regularly and walked back toward the road the guild team would arrive on. The first field note said, "Residual spiritual signature at cleared C-rank gate site near frontier eastern boundary does not correspond to any registered spirit's documented combat output pattern in the guild's field reference database. Unknown contractor present and departed before guild team arrival. Contractor declined to identify contracted spirit. Gate clearance complete. Assessment, anomalous signature requires follow-up investigation." The follow-up investigation produced the branch master's monitoring note. The branch master's note said, "Recommend monitoring." The monitoring note went into the regional anomaly file that the branch master maintained alongside the standard operational reports. Kale was aware of none of this in the specific sense of not having been told about it. He was aware of all of it in the general sense of having understood that the field note would be submitted and the monitoring note would follow and the file would be building in the way that institutional files built when something was being documented accurately from the outside. That he went to the Vethra Guild branch on a Tuesday morning in the 5th week and spoke directly to the branch master. The branch master was a woman named Riva Sorn, whose manner combined professional efficiency with the specific quality of someone who had been managing the guild frontier operations for long enough that she had seen most varieties of unusual situation and had developed the equanimity of someone who had seen most varieties without having seen this one. That he said he was the contractor who had been responding to the frontier region gates. She said she knew that he said he wanted to register with the guild. She said registration required Spirit Council certification of a contracted spirit. That he said his contracted spirit was not in the Spirit Council's registry. She said every contractable spirit in the realm was in the Spirit Council's registry. That he said the Spirit Council's registry contained every contractable spirit that had been documented in the founding generations survey. That he said there was a distinction between documented and existing. She looked at him. She said that was not a standard explanation. That he said he knew. That he said he was not in a standard situation. She asked him to describe the spirit. That he described it, the substrate connection, the reading function, the force application through resonance direction, the nature of the entity as he understood it, which was not an elemental affinity expression but the substrate layer beneath elemental affinity expressions. He used the most accurate vocabulary available to him, which was the vocabulary of the substrate spirit's own communication translated into the Spirit Council's framework as closely as that translation allowed. She listened to all of it with the professional attention of someone building an assessment. Then she said she could not process the registration without Spirit Council certification, and the Spirit Council certification required the spirit to be in the registry. That he said he understood. He said he had a different question. That he asked whether certified kills from documented gate responses could be assessed for rank certification purposes if the documentation was compelling enough to substitute for the standard kill certification process. She said the registration prerequisite existed before the certification process began, and the prerequisite required the Spirit Council certification. He said he understood. He thanked her and left. She added a note to the regional anomaly file. The contractor attended the branch personally and attempted registration. He is aware of the institutional gap and is not attempting to circumvent the process. He appears to be building documentation outside the system rather than working around the system. He asked specifically about kill certification independent of registration, suggesting he understands the documentation pathway. Recommend continued monitoring. He continued building the settlement records. By the end of the 6th week the records covered 12 gate responses across 7 frontier settlements, with witness attestations from 43 settlement council members, beast classifications ranging from F rank through C rank, and combat outcome documentation that was consistent in format and accurate in content and that represented the most comprehensive official documentation of an unregistered contractor's gate response performance that had ever been compiled in the realm's frontier. Records. The records were not guild certification. They were something that guild certification was supposed to replace the need for. He was building the case that in this specific situation the replacement was not available and the original thing was. On a cold morning in the 8th week investigator Sale Vorn arrived in Aldren. She had come from the capital. The Spirit Council's monitoring network had flagged the unclassifiable resonance signature through the Vethra Sanctum sensing array, and the flag had escalated through the monitoring system's standard priority protocols to the point where a council investigator had been dispatched. She was professional and precise and carried official inquiry documentation that she presented to the Settlement Council before she presented herself to Kale. He met her in the Settlement Council's administrative building, which was the official space the Settlement Council used for formal matters and which was the appropriate space for a conversation with a Spirit Council investigator. She asked him to describe the contracted spirit. He described it. He used the same vocabulary he had used with the branch master because the vocabulary was the most accurate available and accuracy was not something he adjusted based on the audience. She listened with the specific quality of someone building a report rather than building a conversation, the particular attention of people who were present to record rather than to respond. She asked about the contracting ceremony and the result. He described the ceremony accurately and completely. The resonance crystals search. The duration. The absence of a match. The Spirit Council representative's explanation. The walk out of the sanctum. The 3 days in the Vethra Inn. The spirit's appearance. The contract sealing. She asked about the contract's function. He described the reading function and the force application and the combat output and the settlement records. He showed her the records. She examined them with the same professional attention she gave everything and made notes in the documentation she was building. He asked her one question before she left. He asked whether the Spirit Council's historical archive from the founding period was accessible to Council investigators. She said yes. He said the founding generation's survey methodology was the key question and the archive was the most likely location for the original survey documentation. He said he believed the archive contained documentation relevant to his situation that had not been part of the Council's active knowledge and that had not been consulted when the contracting ceremony produced the result it produced. She looked at him with the specific expression of someone registering that the question contained more specific direction than the question's surface suggested. She said she would note that in the report. He said he appreciated it. She left. She noted it. The investigator's report reached the Spirit Council's senior directorate 2 weeks after her visit to Aldren. The directorate had 4 members and the 4 members produced 4 responses to the report that were as different from each other as the 4 members were from each other. Director Calla Morn, whose background was enforcement and whose institutional priority was regulatory consistency, said the contract should be dissolved and the Spirit returned to whatever layer of the substrate it occupied, because an unregistered Spirit operating in the realm without Council oversight was a precedent the Council could not allow regardless of the circumstances of the specific case. Director Aaron Dale, whose background was research and whose institutional priority was expanding the Council's knowledge base, said the contract should be maintained under Council supervision for research purposes and Cale placed in a supervised development program while the Council studied the substrate connections properties. Director Aldren Voss, whose background was historical documentation and whose institutional priority was institutional accuracy, said nothing in the initial directorate discussion because she was in the archive before the discussion ended, pulling the founding period's documentation based on the investigator's note about the survey methodology question, reading papers she had not read in years and looking for something she was not yet certain was there. Director Aldrich Shen, whose background was strategic operations and whose institutional priority was the Council's capacity to respond to the realm's needs, said Cale should be recruited immediately and his contract integrated into the Council's operational framework because whatever the substrate connection was, it represented a resource the Council did not have and the Council's interests were served by having it. The 4 responses produced a deadlock that was broken when Director Voss returned from the archive. She placed a document on the directorate table. She said the investigator's note about the founding generation survey methodology had led her to a section of the archive she had last consulted approximately 15 years ago during a different research inquiry and that the section contained a document she had read at that time and had not thought significant at the time and was now looking at with an entirely different understanding. The document was the founding scholar's primordial contract theory. She read the relevant sections to the directorate. The deadlock ended. At the same time the Vethra Branch Master's regional anomaly file reached the Adventure Guild's High Council through the standard regional escalation pathway that Frontier Anomaly reports followed when they accumulated enough entries to trigger the escalation threshold. The file contained the Branch Master's monitoring notes, Corvin Ashfeld's 2 field notes, the Branch Master's account of Cale's registration attempt, and the settlement records that the Branch Master had obtained copies of through the Regional Administrative Network. The Guild's High Council's operational response was immediate in the way that operational responses were immediate when the operational priority was clear. The realm had abyss gates. The gates had beasts. The beasts required hunters. The settlement records described an unregistered contractor responding to gates across the frontier region for 2 months at a combat output that Corvin Ashfeld's field notes placed in the B rank range. The contractor was attending gate responses without certification, without assignment, without the Guild's operational coordination, and the responses were succeeding. The Guild's operational coverage in the frontier region was limited by the available certified hunter population, and an additional effective responder operating in the region without coordination was an operational waste at best and an operational liability at worst. They needed the contractor rankable. The Guild's assessment team ran the settlement records against the kill certification progression table. The assessment produced a preliminary rank designation that the assessment team presented to the High Council with the caveat that the preliminary designation was based on informal documentation rather than standard certified records and that the formal hearing would need to produce the documentation standard that justified the designation. The two institutions began coordinating because the same contractor was in both active files and parallel uncoordinated processes produced worse outcomes than coordinated ones. The coordination took 4 days and produced a joint agreement on the process and the personnel and the format for a joint emergency certification hearing, an administrative mechanism that neither institution had used before and that required both institutions' senior authorities to formally authorize before it could proceed. The authorizations were given. The joint summons was issued to Cale through the Settlement Council's administrative office on a Thursday morning. He read it at the Settlement Council's administrative table and thought about what the joint summons meant and what it required him to bring and whether what he had built across 2 months of settlement records was the complete version of what the hearing would need or whether there were gaps he had not yet identified. He spent 2 days reviewing everything and found no gaps he had not already addressed. Then he told his mother he was going to the capital. She said for the hearing. He said yes. She said was he ready? He said he had everything the hearing required. He said the outcome depended on what the archive director had found in the founding period's documentation rather than on anything he could add at this point, because the institutional framework for recognizing what he had needed the theoretical foundation that the founding scholars' document provided and the document was either in the archive or it was not. His mother said she thought it was probably in the archive. He said he thought so too. She said good luck. He said thank you. The journey to the capital took 4 days. The realm opened up as he traveled from the frontier toward the interior, the specific expansion of a world that had existed at the edges of his geographic experience and was now presenting itself in full. The settled territories of the interior had a different quality from the frontier region, the specific quality of places that had been inhabited for long enough that the human presence had become structural rather than provisional, woven into the landscape rather than placed on top of it. He passed through 3 cities of increasing size. At each city the Spirit Council's sanctum was larger than the sanctum before it and the Adventure Guild's branch office was more extensive and the Abyss Gate monitoring infrastructure was more visible as a built feature of the urban environment, the sensing arrays integrated into the city's architecture rather than standing as separate installations that he also passed gates. Interior gates were different from frontier gates in the way that the substrate spirit's reading function showed him the moment the first one was within range. Not in the beasts that had come through them or the closure signatures they had left. In the gates themselves. He stood beside a closed interior gate at the edge of a mid-sized city on the second day of the journey and read its substrate signature through the contract, and the reading produced something that the frontier gate signatures had not produced, a directional quality, a sense of orientation in the signature that the frontier gate signatures lacked. The frontier gate signatures were present in the substrate as facts, as points where the substrate had been stressed to the opening threshold. The interior gate signature had the same factual presence and additionally had a quality that pointed, in the specific way that the reading function produced when it identified structural load distribution patterns, away from the gate in a specific direction. The direction was toward the frontier. He stood beside the gate and read the signature and thought about what directional quality in a gate substrate signature meant in the context of what the substrate spirit's connection had shown him about the substrate as a network rather than as a medium. He filed the preliminary interpretation and continued toward the capital. The capital sanctum was the largest structure he had ever been in. Not the largest building. The largest structure in the sense that the substrate spirit's reading function apprehended structures, which was in terms of their load distribution and compositional complexity and the relationships between their different elements rather than in terms of their external dimensions. The capital sanctum's substrate composition was layered in a way that the branch sanctum's compositions were not, the founding generation's construction having built the sensing array network central node into the sanctum's foundations in a way that 400 years of maintenance and expansion had developed into something that the reading function needed several minutes of continuous processing to map rather than the seconds it required for ordinary buildings. He arrived at the guest facility the Joint Administrative Office had arranged for him and settled in and spent the 2 days before the hearing reviewing his documentation and thinking about the interior gate substrate signatures and the preliminary interpretation they had produced. The preliminary interpretation needed more data before it resolved into a full interpretation. He had 3 interior gate signatures from the journey and the 3 were consistent with each other in their directional quality, but 3 was not enough for the pattern to be certain rather than probable. He needed more. He would get more after the hearing. On the morning of the hearing he dressed and walked to the Joint Administrative Facility where the hearing was held and sat across from the assembled representatives with his documentation on the table in front of him. He explained in sequence the contracting ceremony and the resonance crystal search and the result, the Vethra in and the spirit appearance and the contract sealing. The nature of the substrate connection and the reading function and the force application and what the combat output of the two looked like from the inside. The 6 weeks of gate responses and the settlement records and why the records had been built the way they had been built. He explained without ornamentation because ornamentation was not what the hearing required. The hearing required accurate information delivered in the sequence that made it most comprehensible. Corvin Ashfeld presented his 2 field notes after Cale's initial account that he was precise and specific in the way of someone reading from documentation they had prepared carefully. The first note's account of the unclassifiable residual signature from the C-rank gate. The second note's more detailed account of the residual signature from the D-rank gate and the placement of the output in the B-rank range. He added one observation that was not in the written notes. He said he had been doing field residual readings for 11 years and had read the aftermath of combat involving every registered spirit type in the current taxonomy and had never produced an unclassifiable result before these 2 gate sites. He said the unclassifiable result was not a failure of his reading function. His wind spirit's reading function was functioning correctly. The result was unclassifiable because the combat output pattern it was reading did not correspond to any registered spirit's documented pattern. He said this was the most precise statement he could make and he was confident in its accuracy. Investigator Sale Vorn presented the monitoring network data after Corvin Ashfeld. She described the monitoring network standard function and the flag that Cale's contract had produced and the flag's escalation through the priority protocols. She presented the monitoring system's raw data for the Vethra Sanctum sensing array output from the period since the contract was sealed, which showed a consistent unclassifiable signature increasing in strength and range as the contract developed. Director Aldren Voss presented the founding scholars' document last. She placed it on the table in the center of the assembled representatives and read the relevant sections aloud in the measured cadence of someone who understood that what they were reading needed the hearing to absorb it rather than process it at the speed of spoken words. The room changed. He watched it change and understood what he was watching, which was a group of institutional representatives encountering a theoretical framework that made every other piece of evidence they had heard suddenly coherent. The settlement records were no longer anomalous documentation. They were exactly the records the theory predicted a primordial contract holder would produce. The monitoring network's unclassifiable signature was exactly the signature the theory described for a substrate spirit operating through a human bond. Corvin Ashfeld's field notes were exactly the readings the theory implied a substrate-level force application would leave in the residual substrate. The panel deliberated. The Spirit Council's representatives produced the registry amendment first. They registered the substrate spirit as a primordial class entity, the first new category the registry had added since its founding 400 years ago. The category entry described the substrate spirit's nature as accurately as the theoretical framework and Cale's direct account together allowed, with a notation that the category was open for additional documentation as the contract's development produced more information. The Adventure Guild's representatives produced the Kill Certification Assessment second. They had run the settlement records against the progression table before the hearing. They had discussed the preliminary designation in the High Council session that had authorized the hearing. They presented the assessment now, which the progression table had produced from the beast classifications and volumes in the settlement records, and the progression table was a mathematical instrument rather than a subjective one, and the mathematical instrument had produced a number and the number corresponded to a rank designation. The panel's senior representative announced the rank. A rank. The room was quiet in the specific way that rooms were quiet when something significant had just been formally stated and the significance was still traveling outward through the people in the room and had not yet reached all of them. He sat across from the assembled representatives and received the announcement with the specific quality of someone who had understood what the documentation was building toward and was now watching the building's conclusion arrive not as a surprise but as a confirmation. A rank. The first A rank certification achieved without prior registration in the Guild's 300 years of operational history. The first A rank certification achieved without the standard progression pathway. The first A rank certification based entirely on frontier settlement records rather than Guild-certified kill documentation. He thanked the panel. He gathered his documentation. He walked out into the capital's afternoon. The public announcement traveled through both institutions' channels in the standard format for significant certifications and registry amendments, which in Ethon's magical world meant Spirit Council proclamation scrolls dispatched by spirit-bound courier to every branch sanctum in the realm and Adventure Guild rank board updates transmitted through the Guild's crystal communication network to every branch office. The hunter community's response was what the hunter community's response was when something changed the framework that the entire profession operated within, which was immediate and intense and specific in a way that broader public responses were not. Hunters read the announcement and saw the rank designation and saw the absence of prior registration and saw the absence of the standard progression pathway and saw the new primordial class registry entry and worked backward from what they were reading to what would have to have happened to produce it. The working backward produced a picture that the hunter community discussed in every branch office common room and every gate response staging area and every contracted hunter gathering for the following 3 weeks. The broader public's response was the response to the shape of the story rather than its content, the legible shape that required no technical knowledge to understand. A person who had walked out of the contracting ceremony alone had walked back in with a rank that the standard process had not produced and a registry entry that had never existed before. Kale took his first A rank contract 2 weeks after the hearing. The contract was a major gate in the Eastern Territories, a B rank gate that had been escalating toward a rank classification based on the monitoring network's pre-surge indicators. The contract was assigned to a 4-person A rank team with Kale added as the 5th member. The team lead was a woman named Davin Sell whose contracted spirit was a high-tier Earth affinity entity that had been developing for 12 years and that manifested in combat as a comprehensive terrain control function. She was capable and experienced and had the specific quality of someone who had led a rank gate responses for long enough that she knew what competent looked like from every angle. She watched Kale fight the A rank gate. She said nothing during the engagement. When the gate was closed and the team was conducting the post-response assessment, she came to where he was standing and asked him how long he had been contracted. He said approximately 5 months. She was quiet for a moment. She said 5 months of contract development to a rank output level was not something the standard system produced. He said he was not in the standard system. She said clearly. She said that was evident from the engagement. She said she had watched a rank hunters develop from D rank through B rank through a rank over years, and what she had watched him do with the gate's beasts was not what 5 months of development produced in the standard system. He said he understood. She said she had a question that he said go ahead. She said, what are you going to do with it? He said there was something about the gates he needed to understand before that question had a complete answer. She looked at him. She said the gates. He said yes. She said most hunters needed to understand what was in the gates. He said he understood what was in the gates. He said he needed to understand what the gates were. She looked at him for another moment with the expression of someone whose professional experience had just been given a question it had not previously encountered. Then she said, let me know if I can help with that. He said he would. 6 months of a rank contract work. He built the substrate signature dataset across every gate he responded to, which in 6 months of a rank assignments was a substantial number ranging across the frontier region and the interior and 2 capital region assignments. The dataset covered gate signatures from every region in the realm he had access to, and the accumulation was sufficient by the end of the 6th month to resolve the preliminary interpretation of the interior gate's directional quality into a full interpretation. The full interpretation changed the picture of everything he understood about the gates. Standard Gate Theory, the theory the Spirit Council and the Adventure Guild had built their operational frameworks on for 300 years, treated gates as independent events. Gates opened, beasts came through, hunters responded, gates were closed. The frequency and intensity of gates in any region varied by factors that had been partially mapped and not fully understood. The variation was registered as regional characteristics, and the regional characteristics were incorporated into operational planning as fixed parameters, which was the appropriate treatment of data whose underlying cause was unknown. The substrate spirit's direct connection showed Kale the underlying cause. The gates were connected through the substrate. Not in the way that the Spirit Council's registered spirits were connected to the substrate as their power source, which was a connection of drawing. In the way that points in a network were connected to the network, each point both receiving and transmitting the network's conditions through its connection to the network as a whole. Each gate's substrate signature contained information about the substrate state in the region surrounding it, and that regional state was connected to the substrate state of the adjacent regions and those states to the regions adjacent to them, and so on through the entire realm's substrate network. The gates were not independent events occurring in a medium that happened to connect them. They were expressions of the medium state, the substrate's condition in any region made visible at the points where the condition had crossed the threshold that produced gate formation. The substrate was not uniform across the realm. It was shifting. Not in the way of geological drift, which was continuous and directional from the beginning. The substrate shift had a character that the reading function described as oriented, the shift moving in a specific direction that was consistent across every gate signature in the dataset, and that had been consistent since the beginning of the dataset, and that, when he extrapolated backward from the current values using the rate of change visible in the dataset oldest entry compared to its newest entries, had been consistent for a period that exceeded the 300 years of the Abyss Gate era. The substrate had been shifting in the same direction for longer than the gates had been opening. The shift's direction, mapped against the realm's geography using the directional quality of the gate signatures, pointed from the interior toward the frontier. The frontier had higher gate frequency than the interior because the frontier's substrate had shifted further than the interior's substrate. The deep frontier had the highest gate frequency in the realm's documented history because the deep frontier's substrate was the most shifted substrate in the realm. The shift had a source point. The source point was in the deep frontier. He mapped it precisely, triangulating from the directional quality of every gate signature in the dataset to the single geographic location that all the directional vectors, followed backward from every gate, converged on. The convergence point was in the Deep Frontier's Central Territory, a region the Guild's operational records marked as the highest gate density zone in the realm and as the area from which the most powerful beasts in the realm's documented history had emerged. He sat with this interpretation for 3 days before he presented it to anyone. He spent the 3 days checking the dataset's internal consistency and the triangulation method's accuracy and the extrapolation's assumptions, and whether any element of the interpretation rested on a step that could be explained differently by the same data. He found none. The interpretation was the most parsimonious explanation of the dataset, and the dataset was the most comprehensive substrate signature record in existence. He presented it to Director Aldren Voss, the archive director, whose role in the institutional structure had evolved since the hearing into something that was not formally defined but was practically the most informed position in either institution regarding what the primordial contract was and what it implied. She read his documentation of the interpretation in full and then read it again. Then she was quiet for a long time. He waited. She said, "I need to show you something in the archive." The archive was in the capital sanctum's lower levels, in the section of the sanctum whose substrate composition the reading function had shown him was the oldest, the original construction of the founding generation without the 400 years of maintenance and expansion that had modified the upper levels. The archive's physical space had the specific quality of places that were maintained carefully rather than renovated, the quality of somewhere that things were kept exactly as they were rather than improved. Director Voss brought him to a specific section of the archive and produced a document from a storage case that she handled with the specific care of someone who understood that what they were handling was not replaceable. She said this document had been in the archive for 400 years. She said it predated the Spirit Council's founding. She said it was from the generation of spiritual scholars whose knowledge the founding generation had built on and whose documentation the founding generation had archived when they formalized the contracting system. She placed it on the reading table. He read it. The document was written in the scholarly language of 400 years ago, formal and precise and built on terminology that the intervening centuries had partly changed in meaning and partly maintained, and he read through the linguistic variation with the patience it required and built the meaning as he went. The document described the abyss. Not the abyss gates. The abyss itself. What it was and where it came from and what its relationship to the realm was. The abyss was not a separate dimension. The beasts that came through the abyss gates were not invaders from another world or another place. They were the natural inhabitants of the realm's own substrate at the shifted state, entities whose existence corresponded to the substrate's character beyond the stability threshold in the same way that the registered spirit's existence corresponded to the substrate's character within the stability threshold. What distinguished an abyss beast from a registered spirit was not that they came from different places. What distinguished them was the condition of the substrate they were native to. The substrate shift produced the abyss condition. Where the substrate shifted beyond the stability threshold, the abyss condition manifested and the entities native to that condition became present at the boundary, which was where the gates formed. The gates were the boundary between the shifted substrate and the stable substrate, the points where the two conditions met and the boundary between them could be crossed. The abyss was the realm's own substrate in a state the realm's stability no longer held. The scholars who had written the document had understood this and had documented the mechanism and had written, in the document's concluding section, that the mechanism for restoring substrate stability was not combat at the gates. Combat at the gates was the correct response to the immediate problem of beasts crossing the boundary and threatening the realm's population. Combat addressed the symptoms. The substrate shift that produced the symptoms had a source and the source was the cause and the cause was what needed to be addressed. Addressing the cause required direct intervention in the substrate at the source point of the shift. Direct intervention in the substrate at the source point was not possible through the registered spirit contracting system because the registered spirits were expressions of the substrate and the expressions could not act on the source of their own expression. Direct intervention required a contractor connected to the substrate itself rather than to an expression of it. The document described the primordial contract as the mechanism for this. It described the substrate spirit's nature and the nature of the contract it would eventually seal and the nature of what the contractor would be able to do through the connection that the standard contracting system could not replicate. It described the source point intervention as the primordial contract's ultimate function, the purpose toward which the substrate spirit's waiting and the contract's eventual sealing had always been oriented. He read the concluding section twice. He said, "The source point location." Director Voss said, "The scholars described it in theoretical terms because they could not read the substrate directly." He said, "I can." She said, "I know." He said, "The triangulation from my dataset produces a location that matches the theoretical description." She said, "I know that too." She said she had read his interpretation before bringing him to the archive and the correspondence between his triangulated location and the scholar's theoretical description was what had made her certain this document was what the situation required. He sat at the reading table in the archive's oldest section and held the complete picture. The substrate shift had been moving in the same direction for longer than 300 years. The shift had a source in the deep frontier. The source was producing the abyss condition in the surrounding substrate and the abyss condition was producing the gates and the gates were producing the beasts and the beasts had been killing people and devastating settlements and consuming the realm's hunter capacity for 300 years of gate responses. Every gate response he had conducted. Every beast Corvin Ashfeld had fought before him. Every hunter in the guild's 300 years of operational history. All of it had been addressing the symptoms of the shift while the source continued producing the symptoms. The primordial contract was the mechanism for addressing the source. He was the primordial contract holder. He said, "I need to go to the deep frontier." Director Voss said, "I know." She said the joint administrative framework that the hearing had produced was still active and that she had already requested a joint meeting with the Adventure Guild's highest operational commander for the following morning. That he said thank you. She said the scholars who wrote this document had known this moment was coming eventually. She said they had not known when or who, but they had known the mechanism was real and the moment would come. She said she thought they would have been satisfied to know the primordial contract had sealed. He said he thought so too. The joint meeting was at the capital's largest abyss gate. The gate was in the capital's eastern district, a permanent installation that the Spirit Council and the Guild jointly maintained as the highest priority response site in the capital region. It was a large gate by any classification, its aperture spanning 12 meters in height and the monitoring network's baseline reading placing it in the A rank classification with periodic escalation to S rank during surge events. The monitoring network had flagged it at pre-surge indicator status the previous night. Director Voss stood to his left. The Adventure Guild's highest operational commander, a man named Vareth Kane whose contracted spirit had been active for 22 years and whose S-rank certification made him the highest-ranked hunter in the capital region, stood to his right. Behind them were 3 Spirit Council senior investigators and 2 Guild A-rank response team leads who had been briefed on the meeting's purpose. Kale read the gate. The gate signature pointed in the same direction as every other interior gate signature in his dataset. The direction led to the deep frontier. The deep frontier led to the source point. The source point was where the shift originated and where the intervention needed to happen and where the primordial contract's purpose had been pointing since the substrate spirit had appeared in the corner of a small inn room in Vethra on the morning of the 3rd day after the contracting ceremony had produced nothing. He understood the full scope. Not just this gate. Not just the surge beginning beneath his feet, all of it. The 300 years and the source and the contract and the work that the contract was the mechanism for. He said to Director Voss and to Vareth Kane, the surge is going to produce S-rank output from the gateway, the initial wave will be 3 beasts, the second wave will follow within 40 minutes. The gateway will not reach full surge if the initial wave is contained cleanly and the substrate pressure is not additionally stressed by the engagement damage, Vareth Kane said. You can read the surge before it begins. He said. I can read the substrate beneath the gate, the surge is the substrate condition expressed through the gateway, the condition is readable. Vareth Kane looked at him for a moment, then he looked at the gate. He said, coordinate with me on the second wave timing. Kale said, yes. The gate began to surge. The boundary between the shifted substrate and the stable substrate at the gateway aperture destabilized in the specific way that pre-surge conditions destabilized, the shimmer at the boundary edge intensifying and the aperture dimensional stability producing the specific visual quality that experienced hunters recognized as the moment before emergence. The first beast came through. He moved toward it with the substrate spirit present in the depth of the contract and the reading function active and the force application ready in the specific way that 6 months of A-rank gate responses had made it ready, which was immediately and precisely and without the processing delay that the first gate response had produced. Behind him Director Voss watched. Behind him Vareth Kane coordinated the response team's positioning. Behind all of them the capital continued its mourning. And beyond the gate, past the surge and past the deep frontier and past the distance that the dataset's triangulation had measured from every gate signature in 6 months of A-rank contract work. The source point sat in the central territory of the deep frontier where the Guild's operational records marked the highest gate density zone in the realm and where no hunter had ever successfully operated for more than 3 days before the surrounding substrate's condition made continued operation impossible. The primordial contract was the mechanism for changing that. 300 years of abyss gates behind him. The source of all of them somewhere ahead. He went in. The capital gate surged at the 7th hour of the morning. Kale had read the surge's approach in the substrate signature 40 minutes before it began, the boundary destabilizing in a gathering pattern distinct from the gate's baseline pressure. He told Vareth Kane what the surge would produce, 3 S-rank beasts in the initial wave, not the 2 the Guild's monitoring equipment predicted, because the pressure concentration was 3-pointed rather than 2. A 40-minute gap would follow before the second wave. Vareth asked how certain he was. Kale said the reading function was reading the substrate directly, and his interpretation had held consistent across 6 months of gate responses. Verith revised the deployment, moving an A-rank unit to the left flank where only D-rank support had been stationed. When the third beast emerged there, it met the correct response. The 40-minute gap held exactly. The second wave was contained within 19 minutes. Afterward, Verith said plainly that the guild's equipment had given a 2-beast probability, and Kale had given a 3-beast certainty that proved accurate. He said the pre-surge function had operational implications the planning division needed to understand, and that he'd arrange a formal briefing within the week. Kale said he had a request in return. Access to the guild's complete Deep Frontier operational records, not the public summaries. He needed the historical gate data to cross-reference against his substrate signature dataset. Verith asked what he was cross-referencing. Kale told him the interior gate's signatures all pointed toward a single location in the Deep Frontier, every gate he'd read, without exception. Verith was quiet for a long moment. Then he said the briefing would be in 3 days, and the records would be ready before then. Kale walked to the gate's boundary afterward and read its settling signature. 3 things stood out: the surge's direction matched the substrate shift's own directionality, confirming gates were expressions of the shift rather than independent events, the interior substrate was settling slower than a frontier gate of equivalent class should. And the settling was slower specifically on the side facing the Deep Frontier. He filed all 3 and went to the archive. The Deep Frontier records occupied 12 cases along the archive's northern wall. He worked through them methodically, oldest to newest. 300 years of documented gate activity confirmed exactly what his dataset predicted: the historical gate locations converged on the same source point his current triangulation pointed toward. Consistent across 3 centuries, which meant the pattern wasn't a fluke of current conditions but an underlying reality that had been producing evidence the entire time. The records also showed him something the summaries hadn't. Every expedition into the Central Territory, without exception, had turned back between 32 and 47 kilometers in, averaging roughly 40, a limit that hadn't moved in 300 years despite steadily improving hunter capability. The logs were explicit about why, not combat difficulty, but progressive spirit suppression. The Central Territory's substrate was too fully shifted to sustain a registered spirit's connection to the stable substrate it drew from. Kale understood immediately what this meant for his own contract. His bond was with the substrate itself, not an expression of one state of it. The abyss condition that suppressed every registered spirit in existence was, to him, simply the substrate in another form. It wouldn't suppress him. It was made of the same thing his contract answered to. He closed the last case at the end of the second day, everything confirmed. The source point's location, the Central Territory's nature, the suppression mechanism, and the 40-kilometer wall no one had ever broken. The planning briefing drew 7 guild planners, Verith, and Director Voss. Kale laid out the pre-surge function's current parameters: 300 meters range, a 40-minute warning window, both still developing. And estimated they'd roughly double by the time his contract reached the development level the founding scholars' documents described as necessary for a source point intervention. Then he explained the shift itself, the directional signatures, the historical confirmation, what the source point was generating. The room went quiet with the specific silence of information too large to respond to immediately. Director Voss broke it, telling the planners plainly that this wasn't hypothesis. Theory, history, and current data all agreed, the source point was real. So was the intervention. The senior planner asked what was needed. Kale said, support to the suppression threshold, roughly 40 kilometers in, the team holds there. He goes in alone. Verith said that wasn't operationally acceptable. Kale laid out the logic anyway: an escort would lose spirit function progressively and be gone by the time it mattered most, present for the safest stretch and absent for the most dangerous one. Verith agreed the logic was sound and still insufficient. The guild didn't send contractors into the unknown alone. Theory or not, the briefing ended without a resolved plan, but with real commitment to finding one. Director Voss found the answer 4 days later, a third document, referenced only in a footnote she'd nearly missed, describing the intervention actual mechanism. It wasn't prolonged presence at the source point. It was a single sustained application. The contract holder directing their full developed substrate connection at the source point generative mechanism, redirecting it from producing instability to producing stability, the required development level. Once Cale ran the assessment, sat above where he currently stood. The gap was measurable. At his current rate, closing it would take roughly 6 months, a window that fit comfortably before the shift's slow progress reached the interior regions. The document also revealed why the support team still mattered. The alignment needed a stable substrate reference point to orient toward. Held actively rather than passively at the threshold, the team's contracted spirits would anchor the intervention's precision from a distance, without ever entering the central territory themselves. Vareth accepted the revised plan. 6 months of focused development followed. The early warning range grew steadily, 300 meters, then over 500 by month 5. The substrate stabilization function, first developed almost incidentally, let him reinforce cleared gates directly, extending their stability for days rather than hours, proof, meaningful in itself, that the scholars described mechanism actually worked at scale, just smaller. In month 3, something unplanned emerged. During a field engagement, a contracted spirit's power surged under direct threat to its hunter, and Cale's reading function didn't just register the surge. It briefly synchronized with it, amplifying the spirit's output beyond its own natural limit. The beast went down faster than the engagement should have allowed. He documented it carefully before telling anyone. Director Voss recognized immediately that the scholar's texts hadn't described this. It was the same resonance mechanism behind the intervention, just applied to another spirit's frequency instead of the source points. Any registered spirit, being an expression of the same substrate, could in theory be amplified the same way. The effect recurred twice more over the following month, moving from accidental to reliably reproducible by month 5, once he learned to hold active engagement with a target's output for at least 30 seconds first. By month 6, his development sat at 94% of what the intervention required. Short of the earlier, optimistic projection, the final stretch slowing exactly as development curves tended to near their ceiling. A week of intensive practice at cleared gate sites, where conditions ran closer to the real thing, closed the rest of the gap. He told Director Voss he was ready. She told him Vareth had already assembled the team 2 weeks earlier, betting correctly on the timing. The expedition departed on a gray morning in the 8th month. 7 people. Cale, Vareth Kane, Davin Sell, Corvin Ashfeld, Sale Vorn representing the Spirit Council, and 2 additional A-rank hunters carrying some of the guild's most developed contracts. The amplification synchronization had been tested and calibrated with all 5 spirits beforehand. Cale's month of dataset work had produced the most complete substrate map of the route ever assembled, every gate, every beast density zone, every gradient charted in advance. The first 3 days passed through familiar frontier territory without incident. On day 4 they crossed into the deep frontier's outer territory, and the substrate shifted exactly as predicted, gradual, not sudden, the stable substrate steadily thinning. The beasts here were stronger, shaped by a harsher environment, and Cale handled them while the team held formation, his own output climbing noticeably as the more shifted substrate fed his contract more directly than the capital ever had. Vareth noted it plainly one evening. The abyss condition was amplifying him, and if the pattern held, the central territory, fully shifted, would push his output far beyond anything seen yet. Cale confirmed it, and pointed out the obvious consequence: the intervention itself, performed at the source point, would run stronger than anything the practice sessions had reached. Vareth called that good news. Cale agreed. By day 8, the gradient toward the threshold began, the team's spirits growing faintly diminished. By day 9 it steepened exactly as predicted. On day 10, they reached the suppression threshold itself, a boundary invisible to the eye but absolute in the substrate signature, the precise line beyond which a registered spirit could no longer hold its connection. Cale stopped the team there and activated the amplification synchronization with each of the 6 spirits in turn, each bond settling into place within roughly 40 seconds and holding on its own afterward. The result was the strongest stable substrate anchor the deep frontier had ever seen, reinforced by 6 of the realm's most developed contracts amplified beyond their natural ceiling. He confirmed through the reading function that the anchor held. Vareth asked how long the team could sustain it. Corvin and Davin both confirmed their spirits were functioning better than normal. Cale told them to hold until he returned, and if he wasn't back within 12 days, to withdraw. Vareth said he'd be back in 12 days. Cale said that was the intention. Then he walked forward through the threshold, alone, into the central territory. Behind him, the anchor held. Ahead of him, the fully shifted substrate opened the way a lock opened for the key made to fit it, completely, without resistance, without the effort misalignment would have demanded. The condition that had turned back every hunter for 300 years was the condition his contract had been built for. He moved through it. The source point was 4 days ahead. The work was waiting. He went toward it. The central territory received him the way old things received what they recognized, not hostility, not welcome, simply alignment. The moment he crossed the threshold, the primordial contract's resonance matched the fully shifted substrate without effort. He understood then what he hadn't before: the abyss condition wasn't an invader. It was the realm's own substrate, pushed into another state. He was the one passing through its territory. The native beasts were fully adapted rather than transitional, their weak points buried deeper than any gate beasts. The first engagement was a hard calibration gap. By the end of the first day, closed, the fully shifted substrate amplifying his contract to a level higher than anything the capital or outer territory had produced. This was the place the contract was built for. He camped without fire, checked the anchor through the bond. The threshold stability frequency still burning steady and warm in the distance, and moved on. Day 2 brought heavier beast density as he neared the source, and he fought with precision rather than speed, conserving the full application for what was still ahead. Day 3, the reading function resolved the source point's directional pull into an exact structural signature. He knew where it was. He knew what it was made of. He reached it on the afternoon of Day 4. It looked like nothing. Bare ground, unremarkable stone. What the reading function showed him was not. The generative mechanism was exactly what the third document described, a built structure, not a natural one, running on an introduced frequency the substrate had never produced on its own. The shift had been made deliberately. He set that understanding aside. The intervention came first. He sat, pressed both hands to the ground, confirmed the anchor was holding clear and strong across 4 days' distance, and began the sustained application, resonance directed down through the layers to the mechanism itself, the anchor's stability frequency providing the orientation, holding against the mechanism's entrenched output not through force but through patient, sustained presence. The mechanism resisted, the way anything resisted change after operating unchallenged for centuries. He held. The resistance gave, one layer at a time. When the duration completed, he read it again. The mechanism was producing the stability frequency. Same direction, same reach across the realm, but the signal had changed. 300 years of drift had reversed. He stood, checked the anchor one last time, and started back. The return took 3 days instead of 4, the calibrated route letting him move rather than merely survive. He reached the threshold on the morning of Day 7. Vareth was waiting exactly where he'd been left. Monitoring equipment registered a substrate shift at Day 4, he said. That's when the mechanism turned, Cale said. Corvin ran an unprompted reading of the threshold and went quiet. The signature's different, he said. It's not pointing toward the deep frontier anymore. It's pointing toward stability, Cale said. The shift reversed. The team's silence held the specific weight of people who had spent 10 days getting here and 7 more holding a line, hearing that all of it had worked. Sailvorn was already pulling out her instruments. Document everything, she said, and did. The trip home took 9 days instead of 10. On Day 5, at a closed outer territory gate 40 kilometers from the threshold, Corvin found the same reversed signature already present. 7 days, Cale said. The reversal's moving faster than the original shift ever did, the shift fought the substrate the whole way out. The reversal doesn't have to fight anything. It's just the substrate going home. They reached the capital on day 19. Director Voss was waiting, already briefed by Spirit Council relay. "It worked," she said. "Yes," Kale said. "And the source point wasn't natural. It was built." She went very still. "By whom?" "That's the next question." She absorbed that the way she'd absorbed the third document months earlier, someone standing at the edge of an answer that had opened into something larger. "The founding scholars didn't know the shift was deliberate," she said slowly. "But the substrate spirit did. It's been in the realm since before the shift began. It didn't appear in your room by coincidence. It was waiting for a resonance that matched, waiting for exactly this." "I believe that's accurate," Kale said. "Then it's been waiting a very long time," she said. "Go rest. The directorate meets tomorrow, and it's going to be long." He went back to the guest facility that evening and updated the full documentation. Every reading, every threshold check, the propagation's confirmed pace, 40 kilometers, and moving. When it was complete, he sat with the substrate spirit's quiet presence in the back of the bond and asked it plainly. "You knew about the mechanism. You knew the shift was deliberate, yes, you knew who built it, yes. They'll know the intervention worked, yes, how long before they respond?" The answer came differently this time, not clean, not complete, the edge of what the bond could translate yet. "Not long." He closed the documentation and went to sleep. Tomorrow, the directorate. After that, the next question. The source point had only ever been where the first answer ended. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to Anime Void for more amazing anime and manhwa recaps. What did you think about this video? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your opinions.